So, this evening we are in Acts chapter 19. This evening, Lord willing, we should be finishing this chapter tonight. We've been in this chapter now for 3 weeks. This will be our third week. Remember, we are in Ephesus. Paul is on his journey, his third journey, and he has been in the city of Ephesus for quite some time. Remember, at the beginning of the chapter, we found that Paul met people who he thought were disciples of Christ, but they had not heard of the Holy Spirit. They'd only been baptized with the baptism of John. And so he rebaptized them in the name of Jesus, and they became disciples of Christ once they were baptized, and they became faithful Christians in Ephesus. Then last week we discussed about the 7 sons of Sceva and what happened to them, and they tried to cast out demons in the name of Jesus, whom Paul preaches. And the demons said, Jesus we know, Paul we know, but who are you? And they leapt on those 7 sons, and they ran out naked. And that would have been an amazing thing to see or hear about. And in fact, that caused many people in Ephesus to believe in Jesus Christ. And they burned their books of magic and witchcraft. We said that they gave up a lot. We said it was 50,000, shekels of silver that they gave up. And we said even if that was $50,000, which of course it's not, that's a lot of money to give up. And it was even worth much more than that. We made the point that they didn't sell their books. People say, well, maybe they could have sold their books. They wouldn't have lost anything. Yeah, but they would have been giving these books that they knew were false to other people. And those people would have been led astray by those books too. But there is a side effect to a lot of people in a city converting to Christ. It's not a bad side effect for the people who turned to Christ. They have a hope of heaven. But for the people who didn't, remember, Ephesus is going to be a very idolatrous city. There's a lot of people making a lot of money on selling idols. And this is going to create a problem for Paul and the disciples there. And so we'll read verses 21 through 41. We'll get the rest of the chapter, and then we'll discuss it in smaller pieces. Why don't we start with Naomi at the front? Why don't we read 3 verses each? We'll go around Naomi to Leslie, and then around whoever wants to read, 3 verses each until verse 41.
Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Eutychus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. At about that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way.
For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, Men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods which are made with hands.
So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. Now when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions.
When Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Also some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So then some were shouting one thing, some another. For the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together.
And they drew Alexandra out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward, and Alexander motioned with his hand and wanted to make his defense to the king. But when they found out that he was a Jew, always one voice cried out for about 2 hours. great is the honor of the Ephesus. And when the city club had quieted the crowd, he said, Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of Ephesus is a temple garden of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Troas?
Therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For you have brought these men here, who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another.
But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. For we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this motion. And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly.
So let's go back to verse 21. Paul is ready to move on. He's been in Ephesus now for 18 months to 2 years. And he's now ready to move on to where we're going to find him going. We're going to find him going up back to Macedonia. There's Philippi up in Macedonia. There's Thessalonica. There's Berea up there. Neapolis is up there. These are places Paul has been before. We note on his last trip, he came through and began the churches here. And he had to flee those cities because of the same sort of thing that's happening here in Ephesus. That usually it was either the Jews who were causing a problem or the Gentiles were causing a problem. But in this case, we have the Gentiles causing a problem. And verses 24 to 26, we find what was the problem here? Verses 24 to 26. Who was the problem, first of all?
Silversmith.
That's silversmith, Demetrius. And what did he do? He was a silversmith, but what specifically did he make? Shrines and idols. And even today, we live in a very ecumenical world. In other words, an accepting world. And there is a lot of different religions that are starting to accept each other. There are different denominations who are starting to accept each other. Everyone's trying to get along. But idolaters in this time were not very ecumenical at all when idolatry is opposed. Now, if you would accept them, they would be fine with that. If you didn't go out and teach that their gods were false gods, they would be fine with that. But if you went out and taught that their gods were false, you need to leave their gods, stop worshiping their gods, that's a problem for these silversmiths, because they're going to protect their trade and their business. It's big business. It's like if some country or some government in Canada went after Canada's oil. And there are governments that do that. Canada's a big oil country. What do these businessmen try to do? They want to protect their business. And it's the same with every country. We want to protect our own business. And if you go after someone's business, they're going to come back at you. They're going to try to discredit you. They're going to try to do everything in their power to stop you. And in verses 30 to 31, all right, they're in this amphitheater. They drag Aristarchus and Gaius, men that we've heard of before and we read of in Paul's different letters that he writes later on. They're men of Macedonia. They're dragged into this amphitheater. And what does Paul want to do? He wanted to enter the public assembly. These people, these men, these friends of his, these travelers of his, are being unjustly brought before the people here, and probably they were in danger of their life if they were not careful. Paul wants to go, but what do the brethren tell Paul to do or not to do? They wouldn't let him go. Now, why do you suppose that was the case? It doesn't say, but what might our best guesses be?
They wanted to protect him because they specifically said that Paul was the one who had persuaded and turned a large crowds. They were singling him out anyway, so
Yeah.
he would be a great target.
He would be a great target. In fact, probably make matters worse. Now, as Christians, we are told that we cannot deny Jesus Christ. That's specifically outlined in Scriptures. Leslie, you don't want to get Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33. Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33.
Whoever then acknowledges me before people, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before people, I will deny him also before my Father in heaven.
So here we have Paul. He's going to want to stand up for Christ. He is going to want to testify that he is doing no wrong, that that he believes in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and that he believes that they need to be, the only way that they can be saved is through that man. So Christians aren't to deny Jesus. But at the same time, Christians do not have to give themselves up just to prove the point. If Paul was confronted, "Are you a Christian?" he was going to say yes. He was confronted directly with the point. If he was dragged before the amphitheater, instead of Aristarchus and Gaius, he was going to make the point. But sometimes it might be better to calm the situation down if we said nothing. Paul didn't have to go to the amphitheater. Others could go in his place to help Aristarchus and Gaius. Aristarchus and Gaius were not going to deny Christ, and the brethren here weren't saying that nobody should go and help them. But it was better if Paul didn't, because it would cause even more problems. It would not solve the problem. It would make it worse. And so they tell Paul, don't go. Don't go. And I'm sure that took a lot of effort, because Paul is one of these people that it's very hard to tell him no. We remember what happened with him and Barnabas. And Barnabas wanted to take John Mark. He didn't want to take John Mark. It was tough to convince Paul of something he didn't ever. So Paul wanted to do something, and it was right, not wrong. It was tough to convince Paul otherwise. Now we get down to the actual appearance at the amphitheater. And we have this town clerk who was, he quieted down the mob. But what did he tell them? What did he tell the people to do? Because this was a mob, this was a riot, this was a problem. What did he tell the people that they needed to do? In verses 35 to 41. Well, first of all, he said, don't riot. That's not the way to solve your problems. Specifically, he said in verse 38, take him to the courts. If you have a problem with Paul or any of these other people, take them to the courts. He says they haven't been robbing, I think Carrie's version said temples. Others might say churches. In you wouldn't think of idolaters having churches. It would be temples more likely that he's talking about. He says they weren't even blasphemers of your goddess. He said, you don't have a reason to riot. You don't have, but if you do have something, take it to court. And his reasoning was what? In verse 40.
Well, they didn't really have a reason for that come forward.
And who would that be a problem for? Him. And he'd get a problem with the Romans as well. Remember, Rome is far off this map, but they controlled all of this. And as we've discussed before, Rome always had a habit of allowing different places to govern themselves if they did two things. If they paid their taxes and they kept the peace. Now, the Romans would have their governors in different places to ensure this, but generally speaking, they let the people alone if they did those two things, at least at this time. They would add some things later. They had to worship the Caesar, and if they did that, then they'd be okay, and that's why Christians were persecuted later on. But if they did those two things, they would be fine. If they were starting riots, though, that's when the Romans would send the army in. That's when problems would start to happen. And the Jews figured this out in 70 AD. They decided to rebel against Rome, and they sent armies in and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. And Rome was not to be messed with. And so occupied peoples controlled themselves to keep these privileges. No one wanted to be occupied by this government. This government was tyrannical, we could say, not one to be messed with. And so, saying if you have a problem, take them to court. Do it civilly. And that's really the way societies function even today. We don't accept mob rule in this country and in the United States and in much of the Western world. If someone has a problem with someone, if someone has a charge to bring against someone, they go and tell the police to arrest them. The police, if they can find a charge to arrest a person on, they arrest them and they take them before a court. It's only governments that are run by dictators and those types of countries where it's just the government coming in and no charge is laid and they'll just throw you in jail or execute you without any charge. Ephesus, the town clerk in Ephesus wasn't going to allow it. He says, if you don't have a charge, you're going to have to let them go and until you bring a charge. And so the mob dispersed because of that, because there was no charge. There was really no reason. Paul didn't go and physically shut these businesses down. He did indirectly harm their businesses, but that was a good thing. Christians aren't idolaters. Christians can't serve these gods. And so if it was going to save people, that's a side effect that other people are going to have to deal with. But I will make the note that yes, there was a large number of Ephesians and Asians who came to Christ, but there were still many more that did not. And so this man's business may have been affected initially, but I'm pretty positive it did not kill him as far as his business went. Are there any comments before we move through chapter 20? Well, if not, let's move to chapter 20. We'll get the first 12 verses of chapter 20. And there's going to be a lot of names and places. So if you have problems with name and places, try your best, but you don't have to get them all right. Start with Tammy. Why don't we do 2 verses each through verse 12.
After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself, embraced them, and departed to go to Macedonia. Now when he had gone over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece.
And stayed there 3 months, and when the Jews plotted against him, as he was about to sail to Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. And Sopater of Berea accompanied him to Asia. Also Eutychus and
Secundus, yeah.
Of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Eutychus of Troas of Asia.
This man going ahead waited for us at Troas, that we sailed our way from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and 5 days journeyed at Troas, where we stayed 7 days.
Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together.
And a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him."
Now when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till daybreak, he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted.
Okay, so this map, really the first 12 verses deals with what we see in this section here. Paul goes from Ephesus to Macedonia. Now, we don't know exactly the route he took. This map is making an estimation of where he went, but we do have him going up through Macedonia. And so if he follows a similar path to the way he went before, he would go up through into Neapolis and Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea. We have him taking of the Thessalonians and the Bereans, so it's a fairly safe assumption that he went there because these people were from there. And then he went down to Greece and to Corinth. Now, we had said last week that Paul most likely wrote the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians while he was in Ephesus. And the way we came up with that is what was found in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, where it says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God has prospered. Let there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomever you shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be meet that I go also, they shall go with me. And now I will come to you when I shall pass through Macedonia, for I do pass through Macedonia." And so on and so on. And this is the context of what Paul just did. That letter would have come to Corinth, the entire letter of 1 Corinthians, and that makes sense now because we know he's going to Jerusalem and he's bringing the liberality of those in Asia and in Macedonia to the needy saints in Jerusalem. And so he's telling the Corinthians, when I get there, you need to have your collections for the needy saints complete. On the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by in his stores. God has prospered, that there be no gatherings when I come. Paul didn't want people just going searching through their houses. Oh, I have this, I have this, I have this. He wanted it organized. And there would be people that they would approve that would accompany him to Jerusalem. And he tells them, I'm not going to come right away. I'm coming through Macedonia, which is what he does. And he gave orders to the churches in Galatia to do the same. And he's telling the Corinthians, I'm doing the same with you as well. And so he went through all around here to Corinth. Now we would have thought, okay, he's wanting to go back to Jerusalem. Why doesn't he just come and do that? It's a very direct route. What do we sort of get the idea happened in Corinth and Greece before he left? There was another problem. In verse 3. The Jews were after him again. He was going to sail to Syria. That's what it says. He was about to sail to Syria. The Jews found him again. And so he did what he did down in Berea. He gave him the slip. He went another way. He went back from Corinth all the way to Berea, Thessalonica, all the way back up. He took the long way around to get there. And then he gets to this city of Troas. And this is a more famous story that we often go to when we want to talk with people about the Lord's Supper. Remember, Paul, the days of unleavened bread had happened already. Days of unleavened bread are known as what? Another word. Passover. Passover. It's technically two festivals, two observances, but they occur at the same time. And so he sailed away from Philippi after Passover. Now, he wanted to get to Jerusalem for what feast? That's what he just finished. To Pentecost. He wanted to get to Jerusalem for Pentecost. That was in, I had it there. Where did it go? 16? Okay, we hadn't read that yet. Verse 16 says, "For Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus. He would not spend much time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible for him, to be at Jerusalem by the day of Pentecost." How many days between the Passover and the day of Pentecost? Penta means what? That's 50. Pentecost literally means 50. And so we have 50 days that Paul's got to get from here, which is in Bulgaria, all the way down to here in Jerusalem. Now, if it was today, I would go to the airport in Sofia, Bulgaria. I would go to the airport, I would get a plane ticket, and I would go and get a plane ticket to Jerusalem. Probably about a 2.5-3 hour flight. We have people who are here tonight from Utah and California. 5 hours? Flight?
To here?
Yeah.
Yeah, about that.
About 5 hours. If I was to try to walk that, that's going to take me a long time. There's mountains in between, hot weather, cold weather if it's December. It's not very nice, not very easy travel. It used to be done that way, though, before we had trains and cars and planes. 50 days to get to here, from here to here, is not that it's a very short time. And think about it this way, Paul didn't own his boats. He didn't own his ships. He had to sail on other people's schedules. And so it was not just going to be simple. He could just hop on a ship and just take a non-stop ship to Jerusalem. No, he was going to have to make stops all along the way. And that's what he did. So the point I make here is, for Paul to stop in the city of Troas, which is here on the western tip of Turkey today, to stay there 7 days. All right, now the trip to Philippi to Troas probably going to be a couple days. So we're probably about 47, 46 days to go. Now you subtract another 7. That's 39 days to go, and he's still up in Turkey. My point is, when people want to argue whether or not Christians partook of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, or just some first days of the week, we go to here to try to show people that if, or just on any day of the week. Sometimes people say, well, we could partake of the Lord's Supper on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. If that was truly what Christians did in the first century, and Paul was in a rush, why would it have been so unreasonable for Paul to ask, I'm in a rush to go to Jerusalem. I want to be there for Pentecost, but I also want to eat of the Lord's Supper with the brethren. Can we gather the brethren together, have a meeting, and partake of the Lord's Supper, and then I'll preach, and then I'll go? That would have been completely reasonable to ask. Paul would have known the brethren in Troas, and I'm sure they would have accommodated him. And I'm not saying he wasted a week at Troas, but he didn't. They didn't partake of the unleavened bread until the first day of the week. He arrived on Monday, if he waited 7 days. He arrived on Monday, and they waited a whole week. It was important enough to Paul that he eat the Lord's Supper with the brethren, because he probably wasn't going to have the opportunity if he sailed from Troas. It's going to take who knows how long to get to the next port, and he wanted to eat the Lord's Supper. And so they waited until Sunday to do that. We find that Sunday is the day that Christians met in the New Testament. We read of them gathering together for prayers and studies on other days, but it was especially the first day of the week. We had already read 1 Corinthians chapter 16 on the first day of the week. Paul again is telling the Corinthians, when you gather together on the first day of the week. Revelation 1 verse 10 is referred to as the Lord's Day. That's where we get the phrase, gathering together on the Lord's Day. John was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And we made the note when we passed through Acts 2 that the day of Pentecost at that time was always a Sunday. Now today it's not always a Sunday because there is a disagreement as to when you start counting the 50 days. Whether it's the Sabbath day, which was Saturday, or whether it was a special Sabbath day after the Passover. At the time when Jesus was on this earth, and all the time before that, it was always the Sabbath, seventh day of the week. So Pentecost was the first day of the week. And so that was the first time the first message was preached. Jesus rose on the first day of the week. Christians met on the first day of the week. And since we find no other example of Christians meeting and partaking the Lord's Supper any other day of the week, this is the authority that we have. This is what God has intended. If we could find other examples or other commands or any other thing that would tell us that Christians ate of the Lord's Supper whenever they came together, then that would be different. But it's not. This is the example that we have. Now, before we run out of time, something happened while Paul was preaching that as a preacher scares me. And I would never want to have happen to me. And what happened?
The guy that was sitting in the window fell asleep.
And died. It's not, if you fall asleep during my lessons, okay. I can accept that. Just don't die on me during my lessons. I've had a scare, I will admit, while I was preaching at one of the congregations where someone went unconscious. Now they ended up being fine. But that sort of was in the middle of a sermon and all of a sudden she hunched over and fell. And you don't keep preaching when that happens. What happened? An ambulance had to be called and that was the end of the service basically. But that's happened. But Eutychus here, a lot of times some people are hard on Eutychus. He fell asleep while Paul preached. There's a lot of things that are taught that I don't believe are really true. People assume that Paul started and preached for 12 hours. I don't believe that either. I don't believe Christians met in the morning in a lot of places because Sunday was not a holiday. Sunday was a work day. And so they would have come together after the work day. We come together tonight. We came together at 7:15. If we would have tried to meet this morning, at least at this congregation, I don't know if we would have had anybody. I think everyone in this congregation works. I work from home, but or I'm out teaching classes. But everyone else in the room has a job. They work. But we do come together in the evening. And so Paul wouldn't have, I don't believe, preached for... He would have preached for a long time if he preached till midnight. But not for 12 hours. And then we have to come along and we're a little hard on Eutychus as well. He fell asleep. Think about how hard he probably worked during the day. And it's not easy when you come in and you've worked a long time. I don't care how good the preacher is. Sometimes we are just so tired. And it's not something that we want to do, but it's something that happened. Now, luckily for this man, Paul was there. And what did Paul do?
Brought him back to life.
Brought him back to life. He was dead. Paul was there to raise him from the dead. And again, this was to show the power of the message of God. This was to show, this was, yes, very nice for Eutychus. He was raised from the dead. But again, this was to show the power of God. Miracles were not used just for show. Paul told the Corinthians, that's not the purpose of miracles. The purpose of miracles is to show the people that we are carrying the message of God. And because they didn't have the Word of God to turn to and study from. They didn't have Acts 20. Luke hadn't written it yet. And so they needed something else. But the time of miracles passed. And that's why we don't have miracles done by men today. Because that has passed. And so Paul preached. He healed the man. He fell out of the window and died. They ate. Like as far as this was Now the next day, early the next day, and they ate together. Christians did that too. And then Paul left. And he was going to sail by Ephesus. Well, he's not going to get to Ephesus. He's going to call the brethren from Ephesus down to a city called Miletus. He's going to be talking to the elders at Ephesus about some things that were going to happen and some things they needed to be careful for or careful of.